What would you do if you were 20 years old, alone on a dirt road at the edge of the Arizona Territory, with $11 sewn into the hem of your only good dress, and nowhere in the world that would still call itself your home? That was the whole of Cassandra Wren's fortune on the morning her uncle Elias Pruitt set her trunk on the porch of the house her own father had built, told her the debts were his now and so was the roof over it, and shut the door before she could finish asking where she was meant to go. She had $11, a tin of her mother's sewing needles, a Bible with her father's handwriting in the margins, and a stubbornness that had not yet found anything worth spending itself on. 3 days later, standing in the dust of a county land auction in the town of Pale Wash, she watched grown men refuse to bid a single cent on 60 acres of scorched, forsaken ground that everyone in the valley still called Canaan Flat. The ruins of a commune that had collapsed under scandal 15 years before, its well gone dry, its buildings sagging into the caliche, its very name spoken like a curse. When the auctioneer, more out of pity than commerce, asked if anyone would take it off the county's hands for $9, Cassandra Wren raised her hand before her good sense could stop her. The men around her laughed. She did not laugh. She had seen, tucked behind the ruin of the old meeting hall, a door in the floor that had not been opened in a decade and a half, and something in her, some quiet, unteachable instinct her father had left her, told her it had been sealed for a reason, and that whatever waited beneath it did not belong only to her, but to every dry, forgotten family in that valley. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Cassandra Wren. If you're watching this from a place the world has written off as empty or forgotten, tell us where you're from in the comments below. And if stories like hers are the kind that keep you company, we'd be grateful if you'd follow or subscribe to this channel so the next one finds you too. Cassandra Wren had been born in the spring of 1871 in a sod-roofed house on the northern lip of the same valley that would one day cast her out. The only child of Thomas Wren, a well-digger and water diviner whose hands, she would remember all her life, smelled permanently of wet limestone and hemp rope. Thomas Wren was not a wealthy man, but he was, in the particular economy of a desert valley, an essential one, and there was a dignity to that which Cassandra absorbed before she was old enough to understand it in words. Water in that country was not simply a resource. It was the difference between a family staying and a family leaving, between a town surviving a summer and a town blowing away like the topsoil itself. And her father was the man who could stand on a stretch of hardpan, close his eyes, and tell a rancher whether there was anything worth digging for beneath his boots. He taught her to read the land the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, the color of the mesquite roots, the particular hush of wind over a hidden seep, the cottonwoods that grew a shade greener where water moved unseen below. He also taught her, patiently, over long winter evenings by lamplight, to read ledgers and deeds and the close legal hand of the territorial land office, because he believed, with a conviction that sometimes embarrassed her as a girl, that a woman who could read a contract could never entirely be cheated out of what was hers. Her mother, Naomi, had died of a fever when Cassandra was 11, and after that it was father and daughter alone against the valley, digging wells for ranchers who paid in coin when they had it, and in goodwill when they did not. And Cassandra grew into a young woman who could set a post, splint a mule's leg, calculate a fair price for 40 rods of rope, and sit up half the night with a lamp and an old survey map without her eyes ever tiring of the work. It was, she would later understand, the strangest kind of inheritance, not land, not money, but a way of seeing value in things that other people had already decided were worthless, and a stubborn refusal to let a piece of paper lie about what it truly said. Her father had one particular story he told more than any other, about a commune that had once stood at the southern end of the valley, a settlement of some 80 families who called themselves the Canaan Company, and who had, in the 1870s, done something no rancher or mining outfit had managed before or since. They had secured, through long negotiation and no small amount of money pooled from every family who joined them, the deeded water rights to the entire southern aquifer of the valley, intending that no single man should ever again hold a whole community's thirst in his fist. Thomas Wren had helped dig 2 of their wells as a young man, before Cassandra was born, and he spoke of the commune's founder, a soft-spoken Quaker named Obadiah Marsh, with a reverence he rarely gave to any living person. Then, when Cassandra was 5 years old, the commune had collapsed in the space of a single terrible year, accused, depending on who told it, of hoarding water, of financial fraud, of some darker sin no one would name plainly in front of a child, and its buildings were abandoned to the wind. And Obadiah Marsh vanished from the valley entirely, and the name Canaan Flat became, among the ranchers who remained, a word you spat rather than spoke. Her father never fully believed the accusations. He would only say, folding his big cracked hands together, that a man does not build something as careful as what Obadiah Marsh built and then simply walk away from it without being pushed, and that someday, he suspected, the valley would learn it had been lied to. Cassandra had carried that sentence with her for 15 years without knowing what to do with it, the way a person carries a key to a door they have never seen. Her father died in the winter of 1890, not from illness or accident, but from the slow accumulation of a debt she had not known the size of, until the funeral was over and the men came to read the will. In the years after her mother's death, Thomas Wren had taken loans from a rancher and moneylender named Silas Vane to keep the well-digging business afloat through 2 drought years, offering the house and the small parcel of land beneath it as collateral, trusting, as he trusted most men, that hard work and good faith would see the debt paid before it ever came due. But 2 winters of failed wells and a broken leg that kept him from working the last 6 months of his life had left the debt unpaid. And Silas Vane, who had grown from a modest cattleman into the single most powerful landholder in the valley through precisely this kind of patient, quiet acquisition, was not a man who forgave a note out of sentiment. Cassandra's uncle, Elias Pruitt, her mother's brother, arrived from the eastern part of the territory within a week of the funeral. Not to comfort her, but to settle the estate, and it emerged with a speed that still made her chest tighten to remember that Elias had, in fact, already been in correspondence with Silas Vane for some months, arranging to buy out the note himself in exchange for a share of whatever the land might later be worth once the debt forced its sale. Elias Pruitt was not a cruel man in the way that villains are cruel in stories. He was worse, in a smaller and more ordinary way, a man who told himself he was only doing what was practical, that a young unmarried woman could not run a well-digging operation alone, that she would thank him eventually for freeing her of a burden she could never have carried. He gave her 3 days to gather what she could carry, paid her, with what he clearly believed was generosity, the $11 that remained after the estate's modest debts beyond Vane's note were settled, and watched her load her trunk onto a borrowed wagon without once meeting her eyes. Cassandra did not cry in front of him. She had learned from her father that grief, like water, was something you did not waste in front of people who might use it against you. She cried once, alone, on the second night, in a boarding house room in Pale Wash that cost her 30 cents she could not spare, and then she wiped her face, unpacked her father's old ledger book, and began, out of nothing more than habit, to make a list of what she still had. $11. A trunk of tools that had been her father's, and that Elias had not thought valuable enough to claim. A knowledge of wells, ropes, and contracts that no one could repossess. And a name in the back of her mind, unspoken since the funeral, that kept surfacing like a stone worked loose by frost. Canaan Flat. It was pure chance, or perhaps it was not chance at all, that brought her to the county courthouse steps 3 mornings later, where a small crowd of ranchers and speculators had gathered for the quarterly land auction, and pure chance that the 6th parcel on the auctioneer's list, called out in a flat and faintly embarrassed voice, was 60 acres at the southern end of the valley, tax forfeited, formerly the property of the dissolved Canaan Company, commonly known as Canaan Flat. No one bid. A man near Cassandra muttered something about cursed ground and dry wells, and another laughed and said not even the coyotes would den there, and the auctioneer, sweating in the mid-morning heat and eager to be finished with an item nobody wanted, dropped the price twice in quick succession until it stood at $9, less than a third of what a milk cow would have fetched that same week. Cassandra thought of her father's hands and his sentence about Obadiah Marsh being pushed rather than walking away, and she thought, with a clarity that startled her, that $9 was a small enough sum to lose entirely and still survive, and that she had nothing left in the world to protect except her own judgment, which told her, plainly and without explanation, that this ground was not what the valley believed it to be. She raised her hand. The auctioneer blinked at her, asked if she understood what she was bidding on, and she said that she did, and paid her $9 in coin, counted out slowly enough that several men turned to watch, and walked away from the courthouse the legal owner of 60 acres of ruin that not one soul in Pale Wash believed was worth the paper the deed was written on. She rode out to Canaan Flat the following afternoon on a mule she had traded 2 of her father's finest ropes to borrow for the week. And what she found, as the wagon track gave out and the ruins rose up out of the heat shimmer ahead of her, was not the sinister wasteland the town had described, but something far sadder and, to her eye, far more interesting, the careful bones of a settlement that had once been built with real intention. There were the low adobe walls of a dozen family houses, their roofs long since collapsed, arranged not haphazardly, but in a wide, deliberate circle around a central common. There was the skeleton of an irrigation system, dry channels still cut with obvious skill into the hardpan, running outward from a central well like the spokes of a wheel. And there, largest of all the structures, and still mostly standing despite 15 years of wind and neglect, was the meeting hall, a long, low adobe building with a caved-in section of roof at one end, but its thick walls still square and true. Exactly the kind of building a community raises when it intends to argue, worship, and govern itself together for a very long time. Cassandra spent her first 2 days simply walking the property, sketching its layout in the back of her father's ledger, the way he had taught her to sketch a well site, noting where the old channels ran, where the soil held a memory of moisture even now. On the 3rd day, clearing debris from the meeting hall's floor so she could at least shelter there out of the worst of the sun, her boot caught on an iron ring set flush into a floorboard near the back wall, half hidden beneath 15 years of drifted dust and the collapsed remains of what had once been a speaker's platform. It took her the better part of an hour with a crowbar from her father's tools to work the swollen wood loose, and when at last the door in the floor groaned open, she found not, as she had half feared, an empty root cellar or a dry well shaft, but a narrow set of steps leading down into a small stone chamber, dry as a bone, built with the same careful hands that had built everything else at Canaan Flat, and in the center of that chamber, resting on a wooden shelf raised well above where any flood could reach it, sat a single iron strongbox, its lock rusted, but its lid, when she finally forced it, opening onto a stack of oilcloth-wrapped papers as dry and legible as the day they had been sealed away. What Cassandra found in that strongbox, over the course of the long, breathless evening she spent reading by lamplight, in the ruined meeting hall was not treasure in the way the valley's rumors might have promised. And yet it was worth, to the people of Pale Wash, more than any vein of silver ever could have been. The papers were the founding records of the Canaan Company, kept in the careful hand of Obadiah Marsh himself, and they told a story entirely different from the one the valley had settled on. In 1874, the commune's 80 families had pooled nearly every dollar among them to purchase, outright and in full, the water rights to the entire southern aquifer of the valley, not for themselves alone, the documents made explicit, but held in a common trust for the benefit of every family who might one day farm or ranch that ground. A provision Marsh had insisted upon out of a conviction, recorded in his own words in a letter tucked among the deeds. That water was a gift held in stewardship, and not a thing any one man ought to own outright and dole out at a price. But the strongbox held something else besides the deeds, a series of increasingly desperate letters, dated across the final year of the commune's existence, between Obadiah Marsh and a rancher whose signature Cassandra recognized instantly, and with a cold drop in her stomach, Silas Vane, then a younger and hungrier man, offering first to buy the water rights outright, then, when Marsh refused on behalf of the trust, threatening in language just barely short of explicit menace to see the commune ruined by whatever means proved necessary. The final letter in the file, unfinished, in Marsh's own increasingly unsteady hand, spoke of accusations of fraud that Marsh swore were fabricated, of families being quietly bought off or threatened until the commune could no longer hold together, and of his intention to bury the true deeds somewhere Vane's men would never find them until honest witnesses could be gathered to see justice done. The letter broke off mid-sentence. Cassandra sat a long while in the lamplight with that unfinished sentence in her lap, understanding at last why her father had spoken of Obadiah Marsh with such sorrow, and understanding, with a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night, that the man who had destroyed the Canaan Company, and who now, 15 years later, held the note on her own father's grave, were one and the same. She sat until the lamp burned low, turning the pages over again and again, as though a second or third reading might soften what the first had already made plain. And in that stillness, she found herself thinking not of anger, which she expected, but of Obadiah Marsh himself, a man she had never met, and who had likely been dead or scattered to some other territory for years, and of the particular loneliness of building something honest, only to watch it be dismantled by a man with more patience for cruelty than you had for kindness. She thought, too, of the 80 families who had once pooled their savings, believing water ought to belong to no one man, and wondered how many of their descendants still lived in the valley, still paying Vane's rates, without ever knowing they were paying for a lie. Beneath the strongbox, tucked into a smaller tin that had slipped from its shelf sometime in the intervening years, she found one final item that made the whole of it real to her, in a way the legal language never quite had. A child's slate tablet, chalk marks long since faded to ghost lines, with a single date scratched into its wooden frame, the same spring. She would later confirm at the county records office that the commune school had been forced to close for lack of families willing to risk staying. It was a small thing, a schoolchild's forgotten slate, and yet it did more to steady her resolve than any deed or letter, because it reminded her that what Vane had destroyed was never simply water rights on a page, but a place where children had once been taught, gathered, and given a future, exactly the kind of future her own father had scraped and dug wells to give her. In the weeks that followed, Cassandra worked with the same patient, unglamorous diligence her father had brought to every well he ever sank, moving slowly enough not to draw suspicion, and carefully enough not to make a claim she could not prove. She rode into Pale Wash under the pretense of settling in on her worthless new property, bought supplies with the last of her $11, and began, in the town's small land office, and later at the territorial capital, the patient work of tracing what had become of the water rights the Canaan Company had once held in trust. What she found confirmed her worst suspicion, and at the same time handed her the one thing she needed most. In the chaos following the Commune's collapse, the water rights had never actually been legally transferred to Silas Vane at all, for the simple reason that Obadiah Marsh, true to his final letter, had never signed them over. And the trust deed Cassandra now held, dusty but unbroken, in the strongbox at Canaan Flat, was very likely still the only valid instrument of ownership in existence. For 15 years, Vane had simply behaved as though the rights were his, drilling his own wells to intercept the aquifer at its source, charging every rancher downstream a punishing rate for water that, on paper, had never legally belonged to him at all. And no one had ever thought to question it, because no one believed there was anyone left alive who knew, or dared to say, otherwise. Cassandra understood, turning the deed over in her hands in the meeting hall, where it had waited 15 years for someone honest enough to find it, that she was holding not a fortune for herself, but the thirst of an entire valley. And she understood, too, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, exactly what her father would have wanted her to do with it. She did not move quickly enough, however, to escape Silas Vane's notice. Word travels fast and cheaply in a small territory, and it was not long before Vane learned that the Wren girl, the well-digger's daughter, whose father's note he still held, whose uncle he had quietly courted into selling out her family home, had bought the old Canaan ground and was seen riding regularly between Pale Wash and the ruins, asking careful questions at the land office that a sensible person would not think to ask about worthless land. Vane came to her himself one afternoon, riding out to Canaan Flat with 2 of his hired men trailing behind him, and stood in the shade of the half-collapsed meeting hall with the easy, unhurried menace of a man who had never once in 15 years been made to answer for anything. He was, on the surface, almost kind, offering to buy the parcel back from her for $50, a sum that would have seemed a fortune to her only weeks before, and framing it, as men like him always did, as a favor to a grieving young woman who surely had no use for a stretch of cursed, waterless ground. Cassandra, standing her ground with her father's ledger held against her chest like a shield, told him she would think on the offer, and watched something flicker behind his eyes when she did not accept immediately. Not fear yet, but the first faint unease of a man realizing that the girl in front of him was not simply grieving, but calculating. In the days that followed, the offer rose twice more, to $80 and then, astonishingly, to $200, an amount so far beyond the land's apparent worth that even the townsfolk of Pale Wash began to whisper that there must be more to the old commune ruins than anyone had guessed. And Cassandra understood that every dollar Vane added to his offer was, in its own way, a confession. When the money failed, the intimidation began in smaller, quieter ways. A fence line cut. A rumor spread in town that the Wren girl had gone strange living alone out at the cursed flat. A visit from the county assessor suggesting, with unconvincing casualness, that certain old tax irregularities might yet be found in her deed if someone cared to look closely enough. Cassandra bent under none of it. She had spent her whole life watching her father hold steady against men who mistook patience for weakness, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she had inherited that particular steadiness whole. There was one evening, near the end of that difficult stretch, when one of Vane's men rode out to Canaan Flat alone under cover of near darkness, not to threaten her outright, but simply to sit his horse at the edge of the property and watch the meeting hall for the better part of an hour before riding away again. A gesture meant, she understood, to remind her how easily she could be watched, how little privacy her solitude out there truly afforded her. She did not run to town to report it, and she did not write to her uncle for help, understanding by then that Elias Pruitt's loyalties had long since been purchased in full. Instead, she moved her father's tools and the strongbox itself to a second, smaller hiding place of her own choosing, copied the most essential documents twice over in her own hand as insurance against fire or theft, and began sleeping, for a time, with her father's old rifle within reach of her cot. Not because she expected to need it, but because she had learned, from watching him negotiate with hard men over hard water for 20 years, that a woman who let herself appear frightened gave men like Vane exactly the leverage they were hoping to find. It was this same unhurried caution, rather than any single dramatic confrontation, that ultimately protected her, because it gave her the time she needed to build something Vane could not simply threaten away. A valley's worth of ordinary people, quietly agreeing, one kitchen table at a time, that they had been silent long enough. What she needed now was not courage, which she had in sufficient supply, but witnesses. And it was here that her father's other gift to her proved as valuable as anything in the strongbox. His standing, built over 20 years of honest work, among the very ranchers and small farmers whose water Vane had been quietly overcharging for a decade and a half. Cassandra rode, over the course of 2 careful weeks, to every homestead downstream of Vane's wells, sitting at kitchen tables with families who remembered her father fondly, and who had never once been given a reason to love Silas Vane. And she laid the Canaan Company's deed and Marsh's unfinished letters in front of each of them in turn, letting the documents speak for themselves rather than pressing her own outrage upon anyone. What she offered them was not a promise of riches, but a plain, provable fact, that the water they had been paying Vane for at a punishing rate for 15 years had never, under any binding law, been his to sell, and that the original trust, if the territorial court recognized it, would return the aquifer to common stewardship exactly as Obadiah Marsh had intended from the start. One by one, quietly and without confrontation, families who had spent 15 years believing themselves powerless against Vane's grip on the valley's water began, for the first time, to compare notes with one another, and to remember old grievances they had long since resigned themselves to enduring in silence. By the time Cassandra rode into Pale Wash to formally file the Canaan Company's trust deed with the Territorial Land Office, and to request a public hearing before the circuit judge on his next visit to the county, she did not ride in alone. She rode in at the head of a slow-growing column of wagons carrying nearly every downstream family in the valley, each of them prepared, for the first time in 15 years, to say plainly and publicly what Silas Vane had done to their water and to their silence. The hearing, when it came, was held in the very courthouse, where Cassandra had once been laughed at for buying worthless ground, and Silas Vane arrived expecting, by every account he had ever received of himself, to walk out of it exactly as powerful as he had walked in. He had not reckoned on the strongbox, nor on the 15 years of careful record-keeping Obadiah Marsh had left behind, nor on the particular, unglamorous stubbornness of a well-digger's daughter who had learned to read a contract before she had learned to keep house. Cassandra laid the trust deed before the circuit judge first, followed by Marsh's letters, allowing the documents to establish, plainly and without her needing to say a single accusatory word, that the water rights had never legally passed to Vane at all, and then, one after another, the ranchers and farmers she had visited rose to testify, in the same flat, unadorned language they used to describe weather or crop yields, to 15 years of inflated water fees, of veiled threats against anyone who questioned the arrangement, of a valley that had simply learned, out of exhaustion, to accept an injustice it had never truly agreed to. Vane's lawyer argued forcefully that 15 years of unchallenged use ought to settle the matter regardless of the original paperwork. But the judge, examining Marsh's careful trust language and the unbroken chain of the county's own tax and title records, found otherwise. The Canaan Company's trust deed was valid, had never been legally superseded, and the water rights of the southern aquifer belonged, exactly as Obadiah Marsh had intended in 1874, to the common trust of the valley's families. To be administered, the judge's ruling specified, at Cassandra's own quiet suggestion, by an elected board of the very ranchers who depended on the water, with Cassandra Wren as the discoverer and legal steward of the original trust, seated as its first chairwoman. Silas Vane did not go to prison that day, for no criminal charge had ever been formally proven against him regarding the commune's collapse 15 years before. And Cassandra had not sought to ruin him so much as to unmake the lie he had built his fortune upon. But the ruling stripped him, in a single afternoon, of the water monopoly that had been the true foundation of his power in the valley. And word of what he had done to Obadiah Marsh's honest commune spread through the territory fast enough that within the year, quietly and without ceremony, he sold his remaining holdings and left the valley altogether, a punishment that felt, to everyone who had suffered under him, far more fitting than any jail cell could have been. A man who had built his life on controlling what others needed, left at last with no one who needed him at all. It would be easy, telling this story now, to end it there, with the ruling and the judge's gavel and Silas Vane riding out of the valley for good. But that is not quite where Cassandra Wren's story ends, because a courtroom victory, however satisfying, was never truly what she had ridden out to Canaan Flat to find. In the months that followed the hearing, with the water trust restored and administered fairly for the first time in a generation, Cassandra did something that surprised even the families who had come to trust her. Rather than claim the 60 acres of Canaan Flat as her own private inheritance, she offered the ground itself back into a new common trust, modeled deliberately on Obadiah Marsh's original vision, so that the ruined meeting hall where she had found the strongbox might be rebuilt as a shared schoolhouse and gathering place for the valley's children. The very thing, she said, that a commune had once tried to build and had been destroyed for trying. She kept for herself only a small parcel near the old well, enough for a modest house and a well-digging operation of her own, which she ran, in time, with the same quiet skill her father had taught her, becoming known throughout the valley not as the girl who had bought cursed ground for $9, but as the woman who had found, in a place everyone else had written off as worthless, the thing an entire community had lost, without ever fully realizing it was gone. So we return, as we always do, to where this story began, a 20-year-old woman standing alone on a dusty road with $11 and no home, and a piece of ground so despised that grown men laughed at her for wanting it. It would have been easy, in that moment, for Cassandra Wren to believe what her uncle believed, what Silas Vane wanted the whole valley to believe, what 15 years of rumor had trained an entire county to believe, that Canaan Flat was cursed, worthless, better left to the wind. But value, as her father had spent a lifetime teaching her without ever quite saying it aloud, is not always where the crowd agrees to look for it. Sometimes it is buried under 15 years of dust in a strongbox nobody thought to open, or folded quietly into the character of a young woman nobody thought to take seriously, and it waits, patiently, dry and legible, for someone honest enough to dig for it, and brave enough to give away what she finds. Cassandra Wren did not restore the valley's water to become rich, and she did not risk Silas Vane's anger to settle an old score on her own behalf. She did it because her father had raised her to believe that a woman who could read a contract could never entirely be cheated, and because Obadiah Marsh, 15 years before her, had believed that water, like justice, like memory, like the truth itself, was never meant to belong to only one man. In restoring what Marsh had built, she restored something in herself as well. The sense, stolen from her on her uncle's porch, that she was not simply a girl with nothing, but a woman capable of turning nothing into enough for an entire valley. Thank you for spending this time with Cassandra Wren, and with the ruins of Canaan Flat, and with the long, dry silence that only a truly stubborn kind of hope could ever hope to break. If her story moved you, we would be so grateful if you would share it with someone who needs a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people are so rarely as worthless as the world insists they are. We would love to know, in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? Until next time, stay close.